So welcome to everyone who's joined. Thank you for hopping on for the Maryland Chambers in partnership with the U.S. Chamber. Our election briefing, I think it's really timely that we're doing this. We're coming up, it's 20 days until the election, the presidential election. I think if you live here in Maryland, yesterday was the last day to register to vote. And I think a lot of people planning to vote by mail. October 20th is the last day to request that mail-in ballot. So hopefully you find the information today helpful, again, and timely. So before I do kick it over to our presenter, just a few housekeeping items. Everyone should be in mute or listen-only mode. However, your webcam may be on and we are recording. So if you do not want to be recorded, go ahead and just turn that webcam off. Also, we do recommend that you utilize the speaker view. A lot of people find that to be less distracting. That's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Finally, at the end, when Ashlee, our presenter, is done, we will be taking questions. We ask that you submit your questions through the chat box. And if we do not get to your question today, feel free to send me an email and I'll put that information in the chat box as well. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker today, Ashlee Stephenson. She is the Vice President and National Political Director for Political Affairs and Federal Relations with the U.S. Chamber. She's going to walk us through what I guess the U.S. Chamber is kind of expecting to happen in a couple weeks, and how that may or may not impact business. So I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for inviting me today. And of course, to the Maryland Chamber. We always really enjoy these opportunities to visit with you all. We're of course remiss to not be doing this in person, but really look forward to the opportunity to getting back to normal and all meeting at the U.S. Chamber headquarters at some point for your visits into town soon. So with that, I run our political program, all of our voter education and issue advocacy efforts, in addition to our endorsements through an election cycle. So while the Chamber does not engage in presidential politics, obviously in a presidential year, we follow it really closely because it affects down ballot races across the country and those men and women that we are supportive of in many ways. So with that, I have a set of slides I'm going to walk through. And as Andrew mentioned, we'll have time for some questions and answers at the end, and I'm happy to share this data with you all as well. This is a presentation that I'm updating, if not every day, almost on the hour at this point, because things are changing just so rapidly, which I'm going to get to here in just a minute. So with that, I'm trying to find the document here. Give me just a second. Okay. That should look right for everybody. Is it good, Andrew? Yep. Okay. Fantastic. So our political program focuses on three major things: maintaining a pro-growth majority in the U.S. Senate as the backstop. This has been the main thing that we've been focusing on for the last 2 years or so leading up into the election. Beyond that, encouraging more bipartisan governing. You certainly know in the state of Maryland with a Republican governor and Democratic-led state legislature how important it is for men and women to be able to work together across the sides of the aisle to support solutions for the business community. This is something that we think about from a strategic focus day in and day out with all of the actions we take through our political program. And third, this brings us really to number two: support more centrist House Democrats. Again, something that Marylanders know all about. It's some of these folks are a part of your federal electoral composition. We have really made this a front and center priority for our own program this year, and believe that it already has and will continue to pay off as we see both sides of the aisle over the last 10 to 15 years just become more extreme in some of their ideology. Not always best for the business community and those legislative priorities that we need to get passed for our own members. 2020, as you all know, has been a year unlike any other. When we go back to January, just to chart out where we are today, It's very normal in an election year for there to be zigs and zags, wild swings in public opinion, things that change, sometimes by a lot, sometimes by a little. What we have seen through this year is unlike any year where I've worked in professional politics, and I'm also a political pollster, so this is something that I study regularly and keep track of. It's just important to understand the underpinnings of the environment and what voters care about. At the beginning of the year, 54% said that the country was on the wrong track. Most of you probably think, goodness, that's not really a great number to begin with. I'm going to show you some data later on that underscores that those numbers have in fact shifted fairly drastically of folks who now believe we are on the wrong trajectory. President's job approval for everything I just said about how tumultuous this political environment has been, especially during the Trump era. It's been just constantly volatile, and we see that in the data. The president's job approval has remained remarkably consistent. I took a look this morning on Real Clear Politics. This is one of the best sources for you to get information and intelligence. His job approval on average today, approve to disapprove, is about the same as what it was in January. 44 approve, 53 disapprove. So for everything that's happening in the environment, these numbers have remained remarkably steady. They shifted a little bit in July, where things really hit a bottoming out. I have a slide on that and a host of different areas. But, you know, all things being equal, this is something that just hasn't changed all that much. Lastly, top concerns, January to today. For our issue advocacy efforts at the Chamber and thinking about the kind of things that our membership in the business community were going to be worried about, we go immediately to get a sense of top concerns from voters. At the start of the year, there were 5, maybe 6 things that were top of minds in the double digits. Also, keep in mind here, we did have the Democratic presidential primary happening in the backdrop, so that may have driven some of this, but nevertheless, healthcare and the economy, 2 evergreen issues that are always going to be big topics in politics. The environment, for the first time ever, nationally, a double-digit top concern. Immigration, Social Security, also not on this list, but education. We were in a completely different place by way of just concerns in January to today. Today, the election has solely focused to be about healthcare and the economy, and of course, the coronavirus being a huge part of the healthcare element. This is a slide that I took from a gentleman named Bruce Mehlman, who I think produces some of the best sort of state of the races or predictive decks in Washington. They release these every quarter, and this one came out a couple of weeks ago, and it was fascinating because it was a reminder of all the false surprises from 2016 that we all lived through and what some of these ultimately ended up changing the trajectory of the outcome. What's scary to me in 2020 are those 2 giant question marks. And beyond that, how do we know that there are just 2? We have no idea. This is the point of false surprises, or as Bruce Mehlman very smartly called it, where the wild things are. This cycle into the fall, we had the very awful and unfortunate passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which leads us to today, what's happening right now in the backdrop, the Senate confirmation discussions with Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. On October 2nd, not too much later, the president tested positive for COVID, and it wasn't just the president. As we all know, many members of the White House staff and the campaign also tested positive. The president went to the hospital that weekend. That was a major event that did affect some of the public polling, along with the first debate, which is earlier in that week. But back to my point, 2 giant question marks, maybe there's 5, maybe there are none. It's impossible to know, but I'm hoping, probably like the rest of you, for not too much more turbulence as we head toward November 3rd. Something we're following really closely, and I think is just going to be fascinating and is also going to provide political scientists years of white paper topics, is what is occurring with absentee and early voting. Because of the pandemic, several states opened up their absentee and early voting laws to allow more citizens to cast a ballot in a way that they feel comfortable and safe doing that. One of the resources that we've created is on our website, voteforjobs.com. You can go and directly see what the laws are for Maryland. Are you already registered to vote? When can you get your absentee ballot, return it, all that good stuff. We keep up with it regularly because it's a moving target. I saw it was actually just announced this morning that Virginia, I'm in Northern Virginia, extended their registration deadlines. So there's a lot happening in this environment. But what we're fascinated in is the tale as old as time, trying to read the tea leaves beyond the polling and the fundraising, now with the absentee early voting, to see what's happening. As you would suspect, because so many of the states have increased these opportunities, huge lift of requests. Pennsylvania, absentee requests are up almost 2,500%, 2,436, if you can believe it. Wisconsin, 748, West Virginia, 732. You get the story. And then on the far right, and this is all available from the New York Times, they've got an awesome resource. Requests today by state compared to 2016. So here you see in Florida that there's over 5.6 absentee ballots requested. And all in today, I think I read this morning, this was updated yesterday, there's actually a little more than maybe 12 million ballots that have been returned. But the real story here is that there's a chance that more people vote earlier through absentee than even participated. It was 135 million in 2016. And some of the forecasters and the academics who follow this closely are saying there's a chance more people vote early than all of the ballots cast in 2016. So it's something we're following pretty closely. For your own efforts, we are saying election day is likely to be election week. Some attorneys I hear speak on television are saying it could be election months, which scares me just a little bit. It's not something I'm ready for and excited about. But the story here is that 30 states aren't going to begin counting absentee or early ballots until election day. These are all lit up in orange on this map. What that doesn't mean is processing. A lot of states will begin processing these absentee ballots, putting them in piles, making sure that the signatures are on the outside of the envelope. Basically all of the work you can do in advance to get ready to start to rip those open and count. But the big ones that won't be doing any of the counting are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin until election day, second tier battlegrounds, Georgia, Minnesota, Nevada, New Hampshire, Virginia. All of this is to say, who knows when we're actually going to figure out who and determine who the next president is. James Carville yesterday was quoted as saying he expects to know the answer by 10:30 that night. He's going to be ready to pop the champagne. I really just don't think anybody knows. Even the smartest, best predictors in politics, because this is such an apples to orange comparison of previous election years, are stuck just trying to guess what all of it means at this point. Back to predicting outcomes. Historical direction of the country has been some good guidance for us in the past as to whether there's a party change in the White House. 1980, 20% said we were heading in the right direction. We had a change. 92, 16%, we had a change. 2008, if you can believe it, just 12% of the country, not that long ago, 12 years ago, said we were heading in the right direction. We, of course, had a party change. Today, and I find these numbers stunning when you compare them to previous cycles where there was a switch, 28% say right direction, so more than double where we were in 2008. 66% say wrong track. And I included this because I wanted to point out again at the beginning of the discussion, 54% said wrong track. I thought that was awful. Now it's up to 2/3 of the country. So of course the big question mark remains, are enough people unhappy that there's ultimately going to be a change in the White House by way of party? There are two issues that are going to determine the outcome of this election. Pretty clean and simple at this point. Handling of the economy. The president is barely net positive on this. This is his real clear politics average through today. 51 approve, 47.2 disapprove of the job he's doing. Slightly net positive. If the president could do or talk about one thing and has one job, it should be to discuss the economy moving forward. And then second to that is going to be healthcare paired with handling the coronavirus. The real moral of the story on this slide is the big red X that just moves down and shows you through September, and the trajectory has been the same through October. Double digits disapprove of the job he's doing. Whenever there was the terribly unfortunate passing of Justice Bader Ginsburg, some Republican strategists said, okay, this might be a chance for the president to finally change the topic of conversation away from the coronavirus. Well, what do you know? Not too many days later, the president tested positive. So that hypothesis, and I think wishful hope from many, was sort of thrown out the window at that point. But this is not a great place for the president to be litigating the race or why he deserves re-election if you look at public opinion. And just on handling a number of issues, the president today, and this is on the latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll fielded after the first debate, Net positive over former Vice President Biden on the economy, 7 points. Crime and violence, upside down. Having the necessary mental and physical health to be president, they're actually tied, 40 to 41, so within the margin of error. Leadership qualities, the president trails. Appointments to the Supreme Court, he trails. COVID, he trails significantly, almost 20 points. Healthcare, same story, almost 20 points. Race relations, 30 points. Right temperament to be president, trails significantly, 58 to 26. Addressing issues of concern to women by more 2-to-1 advantage Vice President Biden has over Trump. So that's why if the president could do and talk about one thing, would be my counsel for the rest of the election cycle, it would be to focus on the economy as his best and greatest opportunity and use of time. This is a note on the right that I just included from something I read yesterday that I thought was really interesting. Self-described investors with at least $10,000 in household stocks or mutual funds back Biden by the slimmest of margins, 49 to 48. In the final 2016 presidential election, this group supported the president, 48 to 42. I think for these chamber briefings, particularly with so many of you being small business owners and likely investors, this is just sort of a unique, different bullet point to get a sense of where that part of the electorate is in looking at this presidential race. Biden and the DNC lead in fundraising. You see that 466 million cash on hand. This was going into October, compared to 325 for the president and his team. In August, eyes really popped open when the former vice president raised 365 million compared to just 210 million. And I say just, certainly in jest, for the president in August. The big story here, and I'm going to talk about it from a Senate perspective, is how this has just totally crushed all historical records in fundraising, and what are the ultimate implications in the election. And finally, I'm getting close to wrapping up the presidential numbers here. The 6 big states to watch. This is a Rust Belt race versus the Sun Belt. Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Biden's up on average in Real Clear Politics polls by about 2 to 3 points. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Biden's up by a healthier margin, 6 points plus. So these are the 6 states I would sit down and pay close attention to if you're really trying to figure out who's going to win, with some of the more traditional states coming off the map this cycle, but maybe working their way back into the mix if you believe what the Biden campaign is putting out. Ohio, not too far away from all of us, being a perfect example of this, where it's been an evergreen swing state. The Biden campaign is saying it's close to being tied. They're investing a lot of resources there. Who knows? But the conversation certainly today is of the former vice president expanding the map, maybe south into Georgia, places like that as well. And lastly, this is a major fuzzy dot, apples to oranges comparison, but it's too fun not to include in these conversations. Looking at the Real Clear Politics final averages in 2016 in these big 6 states, Rust Belt versus the Sun Belt versus today. On the bottom of this slide, you can see where Trump and Secretary Clinton were on their averages. And then at the top, it compares it to today. A little bit of a difference between the two. Florida, things looked slightly closer with Hillary Clinton the president up just by 0.2%. But the real takeaway here is because there's so much question about the polling, whether it's right or wrong, I think it's just important to be mindful and eyes wide open that we're living in a real disruptor election where anything could happen. And it's very, very difficult for pollsters to accurately get a read on people who have already participated through absentee and early voting versus the election day vote, those who are going to turn out on November 3rd, and ultimately discern what's going to happen. That said, as a pollster, I get asked regularly, were the polls wrong in 2016? What happened? The big story is the state polls on average weren't terrible. They weren't too far off. The national polls said Hillary was going to win by about 2 or 3 points. That's basically what it ended up having in the popular vote. But my cautionary word is to always look at things in averages versus just cherry picking one poll or 2 polls and saying this is what's going to happen, because they're all conducted differently. Back to our real focus at the U.S. Chamber. So Democrats need 4 seats to pick up a majority in the U.S. Senate. This is becoming an increasingly tough cycle for Republicans who are already at a disadvantage just by way of the map. From a balance of power standpoint, Republicans hold 53 seats, Democrats and independents hold 47. If you look straight down through that toss-up column, these are all Republican-held seats. I don't want to spend too much time on this so we can get to questions, but today on average, every single one of these races for about 2 or 3, Democrats have an average lead in the public opinion research that's available. So as the environment gets more difficult, there certainly are down ballot ramifications in a lot of these places. And there are also a couple states that the president isn't expected to win and certainly just won't. Colorado and Maine being 2 of those. So it naturally makes it mathematically a little bit more difficult for those incumbents to find their way to success. This is from the Cook Political Report. It continues to evolve. They actually just moved Georgia 1, as we call it, into the toss-up column yesterday, along with South Carolina. Senator Lindsey Graham, who is up and leading the hearings this week for the Supreme Court nomination. Also, Texas moved into the lean Republican seat, as did Alaska. So becoming an increasingly challenging year for Republicans as they seek to hold their majority. Really interesting, back to my point on money in politics, is what's happening in the Senate level with fundraising. This page really speaks for itself. Jamie Harrison, who's challenging Senator Lindsey Graham, raised $57 million in 3 short months. I can tell you, as somebody who has been intimately involved with helping to lead, raise, and spend money in races, I don't know how you direct that many dollars in South Carolina in an effective manner. It's not the most expensive state in the country by any means. So that's just a stunning amount of money to be able to raise in 3 months. I don't know what they do with it, but I really look forward to post-election analysis to get a sense of effectiveness or not. Beyond that, in Iowa, the challenger there raised almost $30 million. North Carolina, the challenger there raised almost $30 million. John Hickenlooper in Colorado raised almost $23 million, and this is more than he was able to do as a candidate for president. Among Republicans on this list, leader Mitch McConnell had a great quarter at $15.6 million. John James up in Michigan, we're following that race closely, raised $14 million. That said, Democrats from the presidential level all the way down to Senate are really outpacing Republicans. And it's a real problem for the Republican Party that they will have to continue to try to figure out. They've made some progress, but these numbers show us from an intensity perspective and clearly infrastructure and fundraising apparatus, there is a difference. Last, just 2 more slides. Real quick, House of Representatives, Republicans need 17 seats to gain a majority. As of mid-October, on the left here, you see this is Republicans are solidly on defense. They're airing ads in 28 of their own held districts. They're only up spending in 25 districts on offense. So that only leaves them the ability to lose, say, 7 of those where they're spending on offense to make it happen. On average, when a president wins re-election, they bring 6 or 7 seats with him if the president were to win re-election. So just from the pure math alone, not looking at this at all or unpacking from an individual race perspective, it certainly looks like it's a tall task. And then lastly, I know that this gets into redistricting, the census projections, and this is something that most of you are certainly very well aware of because of the Supreme Court case just in 2019 and Maryland being listed in that. The census will ultimately dictate redistricting, the numbers of seats in Congress, and then of course all kinds of things like the amount of Medicare, Medicaid money that your state gets, a lot of federal aid, that sort of thing. So it's something we've been following really closely from the chamber perspective. And the next big fight, again, knowing you're all probably pretty familiar with it, having seen it on the news quite a bit in recent history, is what the census does for redistricting, and then how does it determine the Electoral College in 2024? Because the number of seats in Congress directly align to Electoral College votes. We see many of our neighbors in the Northeast are going to be losing seats. That's the expectation. In the Sun Belt states, Texas, Florida, Arizona, all expected to pick up. And lastly, California, for the first time ever, is set to lose a seat in Congress. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you have at all, and just very appreciative for your time today.
Thank you, Ashlee. That was pretty impressive. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat box. I don't see any as of now. Obviously, I guess more or less from our perspective, just one that I had from redistricting goes, I don't know how familiar you are kind of with the Maryland situation, but I think part of our expectation is that our congressional districts may look different after this census. I don't know if you can speak to that at all, whether or not you think maybe here in Maryland there would be any expectation of a change in congressional representation after that.
You know, it's always tough to say, Andrew, and this is these multi-million, if not billion-dollar questions is what this is going to come down to at the end of the day. And I was just on a call earlier with a state in the South who isn't even on this map that's expected to lose a seat. And what that means for them from a political expectations game is very tough to follow, because that's whenever you get sometimes you could call it member on member violence, where you have two representatives from a district, suddenly it overlaps. We just saw this in North Carolina. We just saw this in Pennsylvania. It's pretty tough to go through, politically speaking, sometimes internal party civil wars, which nobody likes, but those are the kind of things that I would prepare for as a state, of course, as a state chamber, not knowing if whether you get involved in some of those. I know you don't from a federal election standpoint,
right.
But that's what's ultimately going to happen here. And it's tough too when there are younger members who have a lot of longevity or they have strong aspirations for a big political career to just walk away from a seat like that because it's a stepping stone. So we're going to see this all over the country as these lines get redrawn. And it's unfortunately something we're all too familiar with as it's happened nearby in recent history.
Do have one question here. I'm not sure if you can speak to it or not, but interested to hear what you think. It says, if Biden wins and the Senate flips, do you think that the tax reductions will all be overturned?
They're saying yes, that the corporate tax rate will increase. I think that it's pretty likely. I mean, it just makes it that much easier, of course, naturally for the agenda to get done. And we know that the taxes have been a serious point of contention through the entirety of the presidential primary on the Democratic side and what today is still happening in the conversation. So I would just bluntly say yes, that's an expectation.
Good. That's all the questions that we have. So with that, I will say thank you. I appreciate it. We will make this recording available to those who were on today. I know Ashlee's going to share her slides with me. So if you're interested in seeing those, let me know and I'll be happy to share. Otherwise, if you have something that you would like me to follow up with Ashlee on after this, feel free to let me know. I put my email address in the chat box. Otherwise, thank you again, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.